Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 154, 10 New Commandments. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Libenson.
And I'm Lex Rofeberg.
And we are back for another reflection episode. Before we jump in, let's remind our listeners of a few things that you can do to help us out. We haven't talked about this in a while, but we would be thrilled if listeners who are enjoying Judaism Unbound would go over to the Apple Podcasts or iTunes store and give us a 5-star rating and even write a review, helping other listeners understand why you love Judaism Unbound, because those kinds of steps really help people find this podcast as we approach our 1 millionth download, which is coming very soon. We'll let you know when that happens.
Woohoo!
We also like to ask at the beginning of these episodes for your generous support of Judaism Unbound if you're so inclined. If you've been enjoying the show, we hope that you'll help us keep this going with a modest donation. We often like to suggest $1 per episode that you listen to. So if you listen every week, something like $50 would be great. And if you listen only occasionally, maybe you'd consider a gift of $18. And if you really want to help us out, if you're able to help us out in a bigger way, we of course welcome and are incredibly grateful for larger donations, for help finding grants, and for any other way that you can help us get the dollars in place that allow us to continue to do this work.
But wait, Dan, how many downloads did you say?
1 million downloads.
1 million downloads. I'm sorry I'm asking you to say it again, Dave, but I really want to underscore that we're so grateful to all of you for helping us reach that milestone, and also that you should stay tuned over the next few weeks, over the next couple months, for some updates on what that means and how you might be able to connect with us in honor of that milestone. So stay tuned.
So I thought that it would be great to jump in and kind of build on our conversation from a few episodes ago, Lex, episode number 150, where we really started to float some ideas that were, I didn't really think, particularly more radical than what we've been talking about up till now, but we certainly got a little bit more of a reaction from listeners than we tend to, including one who said that we jumped the shark. And I looked it up and I saw that the episode of Happy Days when Fonzie actually jumped the shark was episode number 91 of Happy Days, but this was episode 150 of Judaism Unbound. So I felt really good that we had not jumped the shark for an additional 59 episodes beyond Happy Days.
And fun fact, so both that jumping the shark involves a Jew who played Fonzie, who was taking place in Milwaukee. That show, Happy Days, takes place in Milwaukee. And of course, I am from Milwaukee. So just saying, if anybody jumped the shark, I'm honored to be associated with such fine company as our predecessor, the Fonz.
I want to build on that because I think what we were starting to discuss, or continuing to discuss, because I think we've really been discussing this all along in episode 150, was the possibility that we truly are on the cusp of a Judaism that's profoundly different from the Judaism that came before. And I don't remember to what extent we've talked about this before on the podcast, but a lot of times when I give talks about these kinds of changes that I think we're undergoing, I ask my audience to imagine ourselves to be priests or Sadducees living in the year 30 or so and having a get-together to discuss the problems that we're having with the Second Temple. You know, people aren't coming and bringing the sacrifices with quite the same joy that they used to. They're not trudging down from the Galilee as often as they used to. Things seem to be falling apart. There's a lot of corruption among the priesthood. That Jesus guy was here recently and got really upset about it all, you know, and there's a lot of Jews, and there's a lot of other Jews that are upset about it. And there seems to be a lot of problems going on here. And so, you know, maybe we should improve the music at the temple. You know, maybe that would help. You know, and I feel like you can imagine that some proto-rabbi like came by and said, you know, I have an idea for a different approach to Judaism, and it would involve prayer in a synagogue on Shabbat, and it would involve blessing everything that you eat and all kinds of other things that you do, and it would be primarily built around this legal code of behavior. And I could imagine one of those priests saying, okay, but what about the sacrifices? And Hillel would have said, well, there wouldn't be sacrifices anymore, where this is really a different kind of Judaism. And I imagine he would be laughed out of the room because they would say, but the sacrifices is Judaism. That's what Judaism is. That is the very center. A Judaism without sacrifices would not be a Judaism. Putting aside the obvious point that, as Daniel Boyarin taught us, that it wasn't called Judaism back then, but conceptually, he would have been thrown out. Like, that's not part of what we're doing. And yet we know from this vantage point that that was exactly what happened, that we ended up on the other end of this transition with a Judaism that was so profoundly different from the Judaism that came before that very likely anyone who had proposed it on the early side of the transition would have been laughed out of the room. And I think that it's well worth considering whether we are at a very similar time in Jewish history such that we also are unwilling to really listen to a proposal for an alternative form of Judaism. Not that we're making one or that anybody has made one, but I think part of why people haven't made them is because it's clear that we're not quite ready to listen, that anybody who proposes something too radically different would be told, but what's Jewish about that?
I want to engage seriously with why that impulse is there, because I think that there's like non-trivial good reasons to be worried about radical shifts to what we think of as Judaism. And the biggest nervousness I can think of is that stuff will just evaporate. Like important elements of Jewish tradition or Jewish practice or Jewish teaching or Jewish stories or Jewish culture or Jewish anything, those things might disappear. And by definition, if we're saying we're going to radically shift what Judaism is, there's pieces that won't be a part of the new version. And that's A, scary, and B, painful for those who do genuinely connect to those pieces that would be less centralized in future Judaisms. But I want to really emphasize what you always talk about, and which is part of this cool 10 New Commandments frame that you have, and that we're going to talk about a little more, which is we don't want to lose these things entirely. We don't want these to just disappear into thin air and never be discussed again. What we want to do is create a Jewish tradition that preserves its past and that studies that past, so that it's not as if we've got this teleological ongoing march of Judaism where we just lose stuff over and over and eventually we're down to like the last little shreds. It's that we have a process of creating that which is new and putting into the archive things that are old and things, and also keeping lots of things that are old, but for those things that we put in the archive, really taking seriously the idea that in 100 years or in 200 years, or maybe even next year, who knows, like they may come back to the forefront for one reason or another. And that means that we should at least be familiar with what's there. That's the model. Like we should continue to preserve the memory. We should continue to think about and cherish our past and sort of mark it in various ways. We just shouldn't allow it to hold a veto over what our daily lived Jewish choices are. And certainly we shouldn't allow it to stop us from innovating that which is new and that doesn't have the same centuries of tradition anchoring it.
Right. So I've been sort of trying to develop and to figure out what I've been calling the 10 Commandments for reimagining Judaism, or the new 10 Commandments, but it's not a new 10 Commandments to replace the old 10 Commandments. It's a different 10 Commandments. But I've been trying to sort of put together this framework, and this is very preliminary, so I'm really interested in listener feedback on this idea. But there are 10 steps or 10 things we can do, I think, that help move us in the direction toward a reimagined Judaism. And the first 5 of them are about what we leave behind, and the second 5 are about what we put in place. The first 5 commandments that are about figuring out what we leave behind start with 2 points that we can discuss at more length later, but I just want to put them out because then I want to talk about the 3 that have to do with what you just said. The first step is that we should just stop doing the things that don't work. That there's a point at which we just have to leave things behind, and we have to be able to sort of do an inventory of what we ought to leave behind. And my second commandment is that we need help from people who didn't grow up Jewish in order to do that, because those of us who did grow up Jewish often are too sentimentally attached to various things from the past, and that's not a good reason to hold on to something simply because of sentimental value. We have to hold on to the things that we hold on to because we believe that moving forward, they're going to be able to work. And oftentimes I think that it's somebody who's coming to it with fresh eyes that help you do that. The three commandments that really have to do with the grief that you're talking about, and by the way, that Ruby Namdar was talking about recently, have to do, so these are the three as I've listed them. Number one is we have to grieve properly for what is left behind. That's my third commandment. Number four is that we have to study what we no longer do forever. And that's been an important Jewish practice, I believe, that has allowed us to leave things behind, because like you say, we actually never leave them behind, and we continue to study them. I mean, we continue to study about the Second Temple today, even though most of us do not believe and don't really even want it to come back. And the fifth is that we have practices, particularly holidays, that allow us to remember the past in a much more alive sort of way, that's even more real in a way than studying, and that give us this sense of connection to the past, even to things that we don't do, will never do, don't want to do. And one example that I think of there is the Yom Kippur service in the afternoon, where we reenact the sacrificial rites in the temple, not the actual sacrifice part. We only read about that, but all the bowing and various other kind of physicality of it, which is something that's not so much part of the Judaism that we inhabit in Rabbinic Judaism. But on Yom Kippur, we have this more physical reenactment of that time that really, I think, brings us into that moment, but only once a year.
And I think I'd also throw in that in a certain sense, like every prayer service is a kind of reenactment, because they're like the thrice a day model of daily prayer that drove initial forms of Rabbinic Judaism and continues to drive many Jews today, was built on the sacrifices. Like it is itself kind of a reenactment, and it's kind of a shout out to a version of to one segment of the Jewish past, even as it is also simultaneously a drastic departure from that past, because it is a very different form of relationship to God. So I think that's a really good point. I want to dwell on the folks who aren't Jewish, folks who didn't grow up Jewish piece. I think the wording you used is interesting, because you mentioned people who didn't grow up Jewish, and I can't decide if I'm super in love with that framing or if I'm super opposed to that framing, or both, which is what I tend to do. Mm-hmm. But like what I like about it is that it acknowledges simultaneously two groups. One group who didn't grow up Jewish and still isn't Jewish, non-Jews. I mean, we still, after 3 years of this podcast, haven't figured out a good term for folks who aren't Jewish, but people who do not identify as Jews. And then there's also people who didn't grow up Jewish who now are Jews. So I like that on some level we're recognizing both of those groups have a role to play because of the broad framing of those who didn't grow up Jewish. Now, part of me, though, wants to really be blunt and say, learn specifically from those who are not Jewish. So that subcategory that I first mentioned, that didn't grow up Jewish and still isn't Jewish, because that's the half of the equation that I think we struggle with more. We struggle with both. We certainly overprivilege voices who were born Jewish over those who converted to Judaism in all sorts of different ways. But I think even more than that, we assume that it is only Jews themselves that have in the past, can in the present, and will in the future mold what Judaism is. And that's factually wrong. It's about the past and the present, it's certainly wrong. And I would presume if the future turns out to be anything like the past and the present, like it will continue to be wrong. Because as we've talked about over and over again on the podcast, every iteration of Judaism in every context, in every era, has both shaped in some form the society in which it is, and also been shaped by the societies that are surrounding it, or that are it. I mean, Jews have never been like totally discrete and separate from their societies. That's a myth that we sort of manufacture in our minds. So I'd really love us to poke on that commandment that says, let's learn specifically from those who not only didn't grow up Jewish, but are still not Jewish, because that fact doesn't make them non-participants or non-shapers of Judaism. It historically has no bearing on whether somebody can shape Judaism. And that's been true on everything from Stoicism influencing the Talmud, as we spoke about with Burton Vysotsky back in the day, to all sorts of Middle Eastern religions shaping things like shaking a lulav on Sukkot, to in Europe being shaped by the Christianities that were often surrounding us, to in America being shaped by the societies and the trends that are going on now. So I'd really love us to open ourselves to the idea that absolutely this Judaism thing, to the extent it exists, is not only being shaped by those who are part of it, who identify as being it, but by those who are adjacent to it, or even not entirely adjacent to it, but just part of society writ large, and by living their lives end up influencing Judaism as a constituent part of our country and our world. So I'm going to throw it back to you, Dan, but can you just really lift up and remind us of that 5 and 5 framing? Because I think it's really powerful, and we can keep rolling with this thread, obviously, but remind us and our listeners, like, what's that 5 and 5 frame? And then let's see where this conversation goes.
The first 5 have to do only with leaving elements of former Judaism behind, and the second 5 have to do with developing aspects of new Judaism. And I think that there's an important role to be played by folks who didn't grow up Jewish and or are not Jewish currently in both of those. And for at least the first step, I'm saying that we have to leave a big chunk of Judaism behind, I think primarily for 2 reasons. Number one, and most importantly, parts don't work anymore for all kinds of reasons, in terms of who the Jews are today, what they believe and don't believe, their level of education, the kind of leadership they're looking for, their attitude towards imposed authority, all these reasons that we've talked about before and we'll talk about again, that the existing forms of Judaism, I believe, don't really work for the vast majority of Jews. A lot of things has to be left behind and should be left behind. The other reason that we have to leave things behind is because if we believe that we need a bunch of new things in order to make Judaism really compelling, there's a limited bandwidth that we have for more and more Judaism. And if you just only add and never take away, then I think something becomes very heavy. It also becomes very glitchy because you're adding pieces into a system that weren't designed to work within the system, and they end up with all kinds of ways that they mismatch and they cause issues and problems. And so sometimes it's okay to add various new pieces to a system, but sometimes you just have to kind of remake the system. And I again, believe this is one of those times. Let's just say, for example, just for the benefit of the fact that most Jews who are not Orthodox do not participate in the Mincha afternoon service. So let's say, for example, that that's something that needs to be left behind because the vast majority of people have voted with their feet that they're not participating in the Mincha service. By the way, I think it's much more than that, of course, but let's just take one that I think is relatively not too controversial. And to say, okay, we need to leave that behind, both because people, it doesn't work for people, and because we actually have other ideas of what people can be doing in the afternoons, and, they can't do them both. But the only reason why we don't leave it behind is because for many of us, it feels wrong to leave something behind. My great-grandfather did this. I mean, I'm not going to do it, but the idea that I'm going to endorse that Judaism should leave it behind, it feels like too much of a betrayal to my ancestors, and in other cases, there may be all kinds of other reasons why people want to retain something that have nothing to do with their belief that it actually works for them or for anyone or, any kind of analysis. It's simply because of sentiment. What I'm saying there is that is where our friends, family, fellow Jews who did not grow up Jewish can step in and say, you know what, when I really look at this, not through the lens of, my grandfather's done this for 2,000 years, I really don't get why this is something that we should continue to do. You don't believe in God, you don't believe, right? And I feel like those clear eyes are particularly helpful in this phase. So that's a piece that I just want to clarify in terms of the way that I'm trying to frame this out.
So I want to model the process that I think you're endorsing and that I'm certainly endorsing, which is that we should absolutely be having more conversations with the premise being which things do we excise, which things do we cut, and vigorously shouting at each other, as many eras of Jews have done, about which pieces those should be, and fewer conversations that are premised on the idea, oh, we're going to keep all the prayer services, let's have the best versions of them that we can. And by the way, I say that as somebody who actually really likes prayer services. Like I actually do connect to this. But here's where my hot take comes in, and where I'm modeling the process that I think we need to do. I think Mincha is, if we're going to keep one of the three services, I think Mincha should actually be the one. The afternoon service you mentioned, I think actually that's the one that we should keep, and I would prefer to excise the others, and I think it would be more effective to excise the others. And here's why I think that. One, Mincha is the shortest. It's the most compact of the services you can do traditionally. And obviously, along with this conversation, we could revision entirely what any of these things are, how many prayers, how many words, if there's words, what, like, we could have all those conversations too. But historically and contemporarily, Mincha is very quick. And it's something that people can do at the office. It's something they can do in a 15-minute break from whatever they're doing. It's something you can do on a lunch break. I mean, it's compact. And I think that's a benefit. And for me, in my daily practice, I find it much easier actually to find 15 minutes in an afternoon. Like, this is just me personally. I won't speak for everybody. Like, I find it easier to here and there do a 15-minute form of mincha for myself. It's almost never the like traditional from the book one, but something than I do to find 15 minutes even or longer at nighttime for Ma'ariv, the night service, or in the morning certainly for Shacharit, for the morning service, which is the longest of the three. So like, I think I actually care less about mincha and afternoon service than I do about having this conversation. I'm just trying to model it. But like, I do think that these are the kinds of things that we should be yelling at each other over. Like, and
I'd say we should call in some of our not Jewish friends to help us.
Yeah, and
this,
look,
right?
Muslims have 5 prayers a day. I mean, not all of them, but like many of them do. And like, I'm curious. Look, I don't actually know a ton about the liturgical substance of the five prayer times that make up a Muslim traditional day, but like, I'm very curious to learn what that looks like for contemporary American Muslims, especially, and how we could map that onto us. That's like a super great example of where we could learn. But like, basically, I want to actively make these decisions. I want to actively have the conversation. Oh, people aren't doing these prayer services. Like, by inertia, it looks as if the afternoon service, mincha, is like the one that is least, that people are doing least. And we could sort of accept that as inertia drove a set of things, and maybe they reflect real dynamics of how people, what people prioritize. Or we could say we don't want inertia to drive all this stuff. We want to actually decide this so that in 300 years, it's not just, oh, mincha disappeared because it disappeared. And it's actually that, oh, we decided that X, Y, or Z set of prayers are the ones we really want to cherish and keep, and the rest we're going to discard. Like, we too often, I look back at Jewish history, and sometimes the accidents are nice, and like accidental things happen, and certain rituals die and others start. But like, I remember with Ilan Babchuk, he mentioned like, nobody's really sweating the fact that Yom Nicanor, some obscure holiday mentioned in the Talmud, died. Like, more and more, I kind of am. Like, what if that could have been really cool? Like, So my question is, how do we try all this? How do we give these various things a shot and decide, okay, these are the ones we're going to keep, with the knowledge that we're going to have to, as you said, discard a big old chunk of what we think of as the core or as the cycle of the Jewish year and practice.
What's really interesting about this disagreement that we have about mincha is that, let's say that I win this one, that we recruit all of our non-Jewish friends in, and they kind of say this mincha thing, it doesn't work. Lex, that was a nice explanation, but like, I don't think this one's going to make it. Then for you, I think that would be really a sad thing.
Totally.
And if I just kind of strong arm you into, or strong arm this situation and say, I'm inventing a new Judaism that doesn't have mincha, whatever, and Lex, sorry you lost this one, then you're much more likely to become a thorn in my side. If I say, Lex, this is something that I think you have to grieve in the same way that we've been grieving the loss of the sacrificial service for the last 2,000 years. Let me help you develop a way to grieve, and let me grieve with you. Because the truth is that I don't really grieve so much for the loss of the mincha service because I don't really connect to it. But I do grieve for the loss of elements that have been with us for a long time. And I understand the emotional feeling of that I'm leaving something behind that was important to my ancestors. So I would like to grieve for it. And let's find a way. What would it look like to take mincha seriously as something that we once did, even though on the weight of the evidence, we shouldn't continue to do it? And I think that because we don't do that, because we tend to treat these elements of Judaism that we don't connect to in a more cavalier way, and we just kind of often talk about it as like, we shouldn't do that anymore, and let's just try to move away from it. I think we're actually missing a really important step, and a step that we've traditionally been actually quite good at. And especially the irony to me is that when people talk about what Judaism does really well, they often say that Judaism does death really well, that we're really great at grieving for people who die. But we're not very good anymore, it seems, but we used to be, at grieving for elements of Judaism that die. And so what would it look like to build that same grief into a post-rabbinic Judaism? I have no idea. But if we're not even starting to think about it and analyze it that way, then we're certainly not going to do it. So, it starts to raise these questions like, what would our holidays look like if we reenacted the way we used to do them in rabbinic Judaism? So on Yom Kippur, if we would, be doing something completely different, but we would spend an hour reenacting the services from our local, conservative synagogue or whatever, that would be like, it's a little funny, but it's also, I could imagine it being quite wonderful.
Wonderful. I love that you just said wonderful, because you're a mind reader, and I was just going to talk and am going to talk about It's a Wonderful Life, the movie, because I think it's like a funky analog here, because the plot of It's a Wonderful Life, for those who haven't seen it, is it's about the main character, George Bailey, who sort of enters into an alternate universe with his guardian angel character, and he gets to see what the world would be like without himself. So George Bailey gets to see what the world would be like without George Bailey, and it's way worse. And there's all sorts of people, in his life that would be worse off in X, Y, or Z way. And it's this beautiful moral teaching about how each one of us really does have an impact, even if sometimes it feels like we're worthless and like we're not really having an impact on the world. And I guess what I'm proposing to make some sense out of this, and why I brought it up, I guess what I'm proposing is, what if we played It's a Wonderful Life with every prayer? What if we played It's a Wonderful Life with every holiday? What if we played It's a Wonderful Life with every Jewish ritual we could, and we saw in which alternate universe would we lose the most to not have that prayer or that ritual or that holiday? I could imagine, this is my instinct, that if we led a calendar year and just dropped Passover, that would feel like an immense loss. And there are all sorts of ways that the entire rhythm of the year would be thrown off, and our collective stories would be thrown off. And like a lot of things would fall to pieces in my mind if there was no Passover marked. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't do all sorts of things differently on Passover and think and vision what it could be. But my vision of the It's a Wonderful Life where there's no Passover is similar to the world without George Bailey. My vision of the world without, I'm going to choose a holiday that I actually liked. My vision of the world without Tu B'Shvat, which I do like as a holiday, the New Year of the Trees, and there's nice teachings to be had about the environment, but I'm naming it because we need to model the painful things that we're asking our listeners to model. Like, it would be painful for me to lose Tu B'Shvat, but the It's a Wonderful Life calendar year where there's no Tu B'Shvat would feel less altered and less substantially worse off than the Passover one. And so my question is, how can we do that kind of thinking? And also, by the way, what new will arise when we do some of this excision? Like, who knows? Maybe we cut out a portion of the prayer service, and all of a sudden having a beginning piece directly juxtaposed with a later piece brings new meanings to mind. We should be seeing what it actually feels like to not have some of these traditions, because some of them are going to go away. And they can go away, like I said before, because of inertia, passively, or they can go away because we said, you know what, we're going to sculpt this. We're going to sculpt a future Judaism, and carefully, and I'm using sculpt as opposed to other kinds of art. Like, we're going to chip off the parts that we don't want, and think of some version of sculpture where you keep the things and you put it in an archive. We're going to do that, and the resulting sculpture is going to be gorgeous. Now, the question I'd ask you, Dan, and which we've talked about a million times before, is the thing really a sculpture? Is it one coherent whole? Like, are we actually talking about one Judaism versus like lots of micro-Judaisms? That's the thread we always have. But like, to the extent that there is sort of one collective beast, I think that thinking about the It's a Wonderful Life metaphor would help us.
Yeah, I meant to write something about this long ago, and I never did. And now there's this new show on Netflix, so maybe it's another opportunity with Marie Kondo, who's the writer of the Japanese Secrets of Tidying Up. And her whole idea is that what you have to do is go through your house and make a big pile of everything that you have in a certain category. And you have to take each one of those items and hold it close to you and see if it sparks joy. And if it does spark joy, you should keep it. But if it doesn't spark joy, you should thank it for its service. It's so funny, but it's so true, right? You literally say thank you to each item, and you put it in the, giveaway pile. But you thank it because it had an important role to play for you up till now. And it feels to me, actually, I first thought about this when a friend wrote an op-ed in a Jewish paper about his process of moving to a new apartment. And I actually called him and I said, was this meant to be a metaphor for Judaism? Because he was talking about how, he went through his stuff, and some of the, he couldn't take, and some of it he really wanted to give away to someone else, but nobody took it. So eventually it had to be put on the curb, for the garbage truck to take it. And that was painful, and it felt very metaphorical. And I think what he said was that it wasn't meant to be a metaphor, but I still think it was an incredible metaphor, as is the book, the Japanese Secrets of Tidying Up. I think that it's really fascinating to think about what it would look like. And I think it's actually quite similar to what we're describing here, that we would say goodbye to elements of Judaism, but we would say thank you. And we would even go beyond that. We would be remembering them in some fashion and grieving for them and remembering them and continuing to reenact ritually our connection to them forever. And the only thing I can think that I'm adding here is that we should recruit a friend to help us say goodbye to these things. And I don't know how Marie Kondo thinks about that, because I know that when I think about trying to engage her method in my house, I worry that I don't have what it takes to say goodbye to a lot of my crap. So I think that I would probably need a friend for that. And I think I probably need a friend for this.
So we've talked about the first 5 of your 10 commandments, this group that's about managing loss of Jewish rituals, Jewish practices, etc. Tell us more about this second group of 5. What's the deal with the 5 commandments that are going to be about building Judaisms in the future?
The first is basically like the first of the negative commandments. It's more of a philosophical orientation, which is that I think that we have to accept that any innovation, we've talked about this a million times on the show, that any innovation is going to be very thin at first, and it can't be compared to the existing Judaism in order to assess its worth. It has to be looked at only in potential. And I guess I'll put out an image here that I got a good reaction to the other day when I presented it to an audience, where I said that in a way a baby is a thin and, kind of crappy form of a human.
Yeah, you talked about this at one point. Yeah.
What does it do? And the only reason, not the only reason, but the primary reason why we love and care for babies for so long is because of their potential to become something that we hope it will become. That the baby will become a older human being who is able to then interact with us and be part of our lives, and as a child and then ultimately as an adult. When we start a new Jewish practice of some kind, I think we have to see it as a baby Judaism, and then to ask ourselves, how do we assess whether or not this is a good baby Judaism? And that has to be based on some kind of thinking about what it is likely to become or what it could become, not what it is now. So that's kind of the philosophical commandment as I see it. And then the process commandments, I think, are these are the ones I'm trying to sort out. But what I have now is commandment number 7 is to modularize and democratize, meaning to allow us to work on elements, one element of Judaism at a time, that we don't have to do everything at once, and that we should be recruiting everybody right into this process, so that if once we're talking about small pieces, you don't have to be an expert in Judaism to work on one thing. And so we can democratize this work only if we modularize, because if we look at all of Judaism at once, it's too big. The 8th commandment is the idea is to recruit our friends who either didn't grow up Jewish or currently not Jewish, or just our ability to look in the world around us and to say, hey, these are elements that we think could come into Judaism, and that we've done that over and over. I heard somebody say, an extreme version of that, which is that everything in Judaism started somewhere else. I don't know if that's true, that everything, but certainly huge amounts. So it seems ironic to me when people say, well, what's Jewish about that? It's like I could point to literally every part of Judaism that you can think of and say what was Jewish about that, 2,000 years ago when it was invented. So that's commandment 8. Commandment 9 is that we should be much more wildly experimental, right? Because worst comes to worst, it doesn't work. But if we're not wild enough in our experimentation, then we're probably not going to hit upon the stuff that really is going to work. And related to that is something like put artists in charge. And here I don't mean visual artists. And we've talked about that also a little bit with Ruby Namdar. He's used the term genius. Whatever the right terminology is, but we want to put people in leadership positions who are just fantastic at creatively coming up with new ideas. And it's a new kind of leadership, because it's a leadership that says, you don't have to follow me. It's a leadership that says, only follow me if what I'm putting out here is worthy. So, but let me ask you this: Are there pieces that you think are missing from this, from these 5? Are there ways in which you think that there are other steps that need to be part of a process of reimagining, of the additive part of this process?
Well, so I think so. And I think that the beautiful thing is I don't think you're proposing that these are the only 10 ideas. I think that's what's nice about it is I'm like, listeners, everyone, like, let's each come up with 10 or 613 if you've got the time. But right. Like I'm thinking about the put artists in charge one maybe. And the reason is I'm flashing to Ruby Namdar. I'm flashing to all sorts of conversations we've had with artists, even some of our earliest conversations with artists. And what I feel like we've heard over and over again from them is that artist isn't some noun that describes a unique group of people that like professionally or pseudo-professionally do art. It's a term that describes a modality of being that all of us can enter into and all of us should enter into. And so I guess like I'm kind of wondering if the point is putting artist in charge, or if the point is putting artistry in charge, or putting the artistic impulse at the forefront or something like that. Because I'm nervous about any of these commandments saying that like any subsection of the broad whole is in charge. Because part of my vision for whatever this future version would be of Judaism, or whatever future versions, plural, there would be, is that the whole in charge idea, the whole authority mechanism would be less important. And that's where all of our conversations about rabbis come in, and why rabbis should be less elevated. Because I push myself on this. I'm not somebody who like enjoys painting much. I'm not somebody who has, as a core part of my life, been a dancer, been like the things that we think of as art. I do like singing and I do like playing music. That's, but I don't even apply it to myself as like I'm an artist in that sense. So I'd rather think about, okay, we need creativity and the artistic impulse and all that comes with when you are a painter, taking various colors, mixing them together, then splashing them on and starting over and doing anew and blending and cutting and adding, and like that whole process of creativity is what needs to be at the center. And I'm less certain that any particular group of people needs to be at the forefront of it.
Yeah, I think that's a great critique and a great way to put it. I mean, I think it would be helpful to think about what's the right terminology? I think that I'm probably conflating two things there, right? One is what you're talking about in terms of the artistic approach, that we should be led by the assumption that we're in a time of creativity rather than we're in a time of sustaining, that we should be led by the creatives or the creative impulse, and not by the impulse to conserve. I guess that's probably what I'm mostly getting at there. And then there's another piece that I think maybe is some exploration or some discussion of leadership in a time like this, which is both about leadership in a time of creativity or in a time where creativity is needed. And it's also a question of the kind of leadership that modern people, modern Jews, want and need.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point about leadership. And it gets me thinking, and maybe contradicting myself, what I just said about no one group needs to be at the forefront of all these changes, which is that I think that to a certain extent, we need to, as part of these 10 commandments or as additional commandments, we need to be actively seeking out those who have not been centered in Jewish life historically, and creating every mechanism possible for those people to be empowered as participants to start, and also mostly as leaders and shapers. And along with that, and this is the harder part to say, we need to be thinking and actively creating mechanisms whereby those whose voices are overemphasized and those who have been too centered in our Jewish, whether it's decision-making structures or creativity structures or whatever, those voices also need to be sort of comparatively lightened. And that's not the nice piece to say, but mostly like I'm thinking of the phrase comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Your rabbis probably used that in a sermon at some point. It's, one of those oldies and goodies. But like ultimately, I do think that whatever future Judaisms we're going to create do in our current world, whether it's along the axis of Jews of color, whether it's along the axis of gender identity and sexuality, whether it's along the axis of Jews who were born Jewish and Jews who were not born Jewish, all of those groups that were the latter in my frames, all of those groups that I said second, need to be centered. And so what I'd add as maybe my 11th commandment and maybe sort of my closing thought is that all of this needs to be grounded in the understanding that we've not ever in Jewish life really created a system or a Judaism or a whatever where all of its constituent parts are really recognized and seen and allowed to be leaders. And there is no make Judaism great again, to be like maybe too blunt with this. There's only a striving for the future where we would create a Judaism or many Judaisms where the voices that have been most sidelined are at the center. So my question in all of this, as we retire old rituals, as we preserve them, as we create new ones, as we look to the future and the 5 commandments that are about creating that which will be new Judaisms, like how can we do all that? By expanding the we that is doing it and including fully those who have not been able to really be leaders yet.
Well, I think that's a good opportunity for me to just drop my 11th commandment, which is, I think, resonant with yours, which is that we need to retell our story periodically in ways that make the process that we're trying to go through clearer, that this has also been the Jewish story. And there are different ways to do that. Some of them that I'm thinking of is that when we're living in a time of transition, it's important to elevate the parts of the Jewish story that are about our previous times of transition. And so the most mythic form of that is during the Exodus from Egypt, which is, I think, the mythic telling of our transitions times, that the freed slaves, the Hebrews, were joined by what the book of Exodus talks about as a mixed multitude. And is understood to mean people who didn't grow up Hebrew, and that together they formed the polity that then became the children of Israel in the northern and southern kingdoms, et cetera, et cetera. And, that I've talked before about the discovery that when you look at who were some of the leading rabbis, and I would imagine then, therefore, some of the other Jews that were part of who the Jews were in the transition to Rabbinic Judaism, many of them were people who did not grow up Jewish and who came from other backgrounds, and many of the Jews left.
Yeah.
And so I think that if we can actually start to tell a story, which, by the way, I think is true, and even if it's uncertainly true, but it's part of our story about when we have had times when we have actually given roles to people who were not previously given roles, that also might be something that will help people wrap their minds around the processes that feel inauthentic or that feel kind of wrong to them, and to say, oh, but did you know, for example, that Rabbi Akiva came from a family that had only been Jewish at best for one generation? And people say, I didn't know that. So I think that there are elements in our stories that we can emphasize and de-emphasize at different times, and that's part of what we really need to focus on when we are involved in these kinds of transitions.
Yeah, I love that. And just one thing that I'd say just to wrap up is I feel like one thing that people bring up as a pushback to be empathetic again whenever we're talking about discarding certain traditions is the idea that, our grandparents or our ancestors would be rolling in their graves if we didn't do X, Y, or Z. And what I've recently started responding to that is I want to hold and cherish deeply what my grandparents would be rolling over in their graves about losing in Judaism. Equally, I want to hold and cherish what my one day hypothetical grandchildren would roll over in their graves about farther down the line if we didn't change. I want us to hold and cherish the fact that our grandparents might be really deeply hurt and upset and infuriated and angry at choices we make for the direction of Judaism today. I want to hold and cherish that and even let it drive some of our decision making, but only to the extent that we also hold and cherish and allow to drive our decision making the idea that our grandchildren who don't exist yet, what would eventually make them roll over for us not changing, for us not being in tune with our times, for us not anticipating their needs, for us not caring sufficiently about what their world will be. I want us to be as nervous about that as we are about our grandparents, even though the folks in the future we don't know yet, they don't have names, they still are part of our story, even if they're not there yet. Because as we know, Jewish tradition constantly exists in the Haya, Hoveh, Yehiyeh, the past, present, and future. We have to absolutely be right there with our ancestors, with Abraham, with Sarah, with Rebecca, with Isaac, and simultaneously be with the folks who don't have any names yet, who will be around in a millennium, because this thing will still be trucking in some way or another. So with that, we're going to close this episode, and we're going to do it in the same way we always do, by calling out to you and asking, please sincerely be in touch with us. Progress report to those of you out there who pay attention to this little outro part. We've gotten a lot of notes lately. We've gotten a lot of feedback lately, questions, ideas, like really big ideas about like, what is this Judaism thing, to very nitty gritty specific questions about things that have come up in episodes. And we really deeply appreciate all of that. And as I said at the top, we especially appreciate it as we're nearing this milestone of 1 million times that people have put aside something in their day to listen to what's going on the show. So please continue to do that. And there's a variety of ways that you can. The first is that you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. The second is that you can head to Twitter, and our handle is @JudaismUnbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And last but not least, you can hit us up via email at dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. We also really want to request that to the extent you're able, you consider setting aside a donation for us on either a one-time basis or a monthly recurring basis. And you can do that at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. We're excited to continue floating along this Judaism Unbound bandwagon with you. With that, this has been Judaism Unbound.